Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. And today we are going to be taking a look at, well, a pretty massive topic, right?
Yeah.
The changing landscape of serious and organized crime in the EU.
Right.
And for this deep dive, we have got our hands on the European Union Serious and Organized Crime Threat Assessment 2025.
Yeah, the EU-SOCTA.
EU-SOCTA, exactly. So this report, this assessment, think of this as your shortcut
Right.
to understanding the most critical insights, the surprising facts, the key takeaways about how this criminal landscape is evolving.
Yeah.
And our goal today is to kind of give you that well-informed edge, without you having to wade through thousands of pages of dense reports and analysis. So
It's a hefty piece of work, this EU-SOCTA report,
it is.
It's built on such a massive foundation of data. I mean, you're talking thousands of law enforcement investigations, all supported by Europol, and input from such a vast network of partners.
Right.
I mean, it's really the most detailed and forward-looking analysis that we have. Offering kind of a crucial glimpse into the threats on the horizon. You know?
Absolutely. And this year's assessment, it really pinpoints three core transformations in how serious and organized crime operates.
Right.
Almost like a change in its fundamental DNA. These are the threads that we're going to kind of pull on today.
Yeah.
First, we're going to be looking at how it's increasingly destabilizing society. And we're talking not just economically,
Right.
through illicit activities, but also socially and through some really concerning hybrid threats. Second, we're going to explore how deeply embedded it's become online.
Right.
With digital infrastructure acting as this essential tool in multiple ways.
Yeah.
And then finally, we're going to look at how artificial intelligence, AI, and other emerging technologies are acting as these powerful accelerators for criminal enterprise.
Right.
So let's unpack all of this, right?
Let's do it.
Starting with this whole idea of organized crime kind of shinking the foundations of society.
Yeah, I mean, what's so striking to me is this sort of double dimension of destabilization that we see.
Right.
So on one hand, you have the traditional ways that organized crime undermines economies and social order, through illegal markets, violence, corruption, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But then the report also highlights this growing trend of serious and organized crime being almost leveraged, almost directed externally in ways that really aim to kind of weaken states and societies from within,
Yeah, it always comes back to profit, doesn't it?
It does.
These criminal networks function these sophisticated, albeit illegal businesses, creating these intricate parallel economies. And what the report really underscores is how entire communities can unfortunately become reliant on these illicit activities for their livelihoods.
Right.
So that creates this really complex challenge for law enforcement and for social cohesion. Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways here is that this is not just about a criminal justice problem.
Right.
This is about a societal problem.
Exactly.
That really requires a much broader response.
Right, exactly.
And to kind of enable these vast operations, corruption remains a cornerstone. It's a long-standing tactic, but it's constantly adapting to this digital age. Right. So we're seeing corruption used to gain access to critical digital systems.
Right.
We're seeing the emergence of what the report terms corruption brokers within this crime as a service model.
Yeah.
It's almost like outsourcing the act of corruption itself, Right. And it really kind of highlights the evolving nature of this phenomenon and how it's kind of keeping pace with the broader technological trends.
Right, exactly. And then there's the crucial element that fuels all of this, right? Money laundering. The sheer volume of illicit profits that are generated annually. We're talking billions just from the drug trade.
Yeah.
All of that needs to be cleaned, right? This process of integrating illegal funds into the legitimate economy not only sustains their current activities, but it allows them to expand, become more resilient, further eroding public trust in our institutions.
Absolutely.
And so, what aspects of these high profit crime areas and their destabilizing impacts, what kind of stands out to you?
Well, as we mentioned, the drug trade is just this massive cash cow, right?
Yeah.
But the report also flags online fraud as having an almost limitless reach now.
Yeah.
And really exposing a huge number of people to financial risks.
Right.
And it's significantly boosting criminal revenue streams.
Right.
And then you have the trade in illegal firearms and explosives.
Right.
Which is the direct fuel for violence. right? Yeah. Creating insecurity, and tragically, often involving the exploitation of young people to carry out that violence.
Right. And despite all of the efforts, internationally to try to crack down on this, the report reveals a concerning statistic, right? Only an estimated 2% of illicit proceeds are actually confiscated.
Yeah, it's a tiny fraction.
It's a tiny fraction.
And the increasing use of digital assets by criminal organizations is making the already difficult task of asset recovery even harder.
Right.
So essentially, the economic engine of organized crime continues to run.
Largely unchecked.
Largely unchecked, allowing them to reinvest and expand.
Right. And that leads us to what I think is maybe the most interesting and worrying aspect of all this is this concept of criminal networks acting as proxies for hybrid threat actors.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, so can you kind of break down what that actually means?
Yeah, so essentially what we're seeing is, if you kind of connect this to the broader geopolitical landscape, right? You see that while criminal networks, at their core, they're motivated by financial gain.
Right.
But their activities can either intentionally or unintentionally align with the strategic objectives of these hybrid threat actors.
Right.
Right. Now, when we talk about hybrid threats, we mean like these coordinated and often covert actions by state or non-state actors that kind of blur the lines between traditional warfare, cyber warfare, and other destabilizing activities. Yeah. And they often exploit criminal networks to achieve their goals.
Okay.
So in a sense, what the report is suggesting is that this intent to destabilize can actually target our democratic processes.
Wow.
Our social cohesion, our sense of security, and even the rule of law,
So these criminals become almost like unwitting tools in a larger geopolitical strategy.
That's exactly it.
Right. And so the concerning takeaway here isn't just about criminals making money. It's about them potentially being manipulated to undermine the very fabric of our society. Without even fully realizing it.
Exactly. And the report highlights, for example, their role in propaganda campaigns,
Right.
So they're actively spreading disinformation through fake social media profiles, coordinated troll operations, and the manipulation of news, and this deliberate erosion of trust and social cohesion really serves the strategic interests of these threat actors.
Exactly. And it's not just about manipulating information, right?
No, it's not.
The report also discusses the instrumentalization of irregular migrant flows.
Right. So by potentially orchestrating or facilitating surges in irregular migration, hybrid threat actors can further strain EU resources and social systems, create division and instability. And this, in turn, directly benefits the migrant smuggling networks, who see a significant increase in demand for their services and consequently their profits.
Right.
And the report even mentions the potential for state actors to make deliberate statements intended to flood the EU with illicit drugs.
Wow.
Specifically to create widespread social instability.
Wow.
So it paints a picture of a very interconnected and strategically manipulative environment.
Right. Very unsettling. Very unsettling.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pivot now and let's explore the second key shift.
Yeah.
How serious and organized crime is increasingly, quote, nurtured online. It feels like the internet has really become this indispensable operating theater for them.
The report really emphasizes, I think, the pervasive nature of the online domain in virtually all facets of serious and organized crime today,
Yeah.
It's no longer just a peripheral aspect. It's often the central pillar of their operations.
Right.
And as the report clearly outlines, criminal networks are exploiting digital infrastructure in a multitude of ways, as a primary enabler of their activity, as a shield against law enforcement. And even as a direct target for their attacks.
Yeah, so let's break down how it acts as an enabler.
Okay, well, I mean, the dark web immediately comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
Providing anonymity and a virtual marketplace for a vast array of illicit goods and services.
Right.
But the report also highlights the significant abuse of mainstream social media platforms and even e-commerce websites.
Yeah.
Right? So these platforms offer, unparalleled efficiency, security, through anonymity and encryption and incredible scalability with minimal need for physical interaction.
Right, and consider the types of crimes that are now predominantly conducted online from start to finish.
Right.
We're talking cyber attacks, online fraud schemes, the distribution of child sexual abuse material.
Right.
So can you give us some concrete examples of how this digital infrastructure facilitates these crimes?
Yeah, so the report details, for example, how victims of sexual exploitation are targeted, advertised, managed, and even paid online, all conducted remotely.
Yeah.
Migrant smuggling networks are increasingly using social media to advertise their services.
Yeah.
Showcasing, like, seemingly successful border crossings to attract new clients.
Right.
And even in more traditional criminal enterprises like drug trafficking, digital infrastructure is used for secure communication, coordinating logistics, and even for fraudulently obtaining sensitive information about shipments.
Okay, so it's fundamentally changing how these crimes are conducted.
It really is.
Now, how does this digital realm act as a shield against law enforcement?
So this is where encrypted communication technologies play a really crucial role.
Yeah.
So platforms like EncroChat, Sky ECC, and Ghost, while sometimes marketed for privacy-conscious individuals, became essential tools for criminals to coordinate their operations and evade detection by law enforcement agencies. Right, so these platforms often incorporate, like, bespoke security features specifically designed for illicit activities, such as remote wiping capabilities and sophisticated anonymity mechanisms that actively hinder investigations. It's like they have their own private, untraceable communication networks operating within the broader internet.
Yeah, that's a significant challenge for law enforcement.
Huge challenge.
Yeah. And finally, how is the digital infrastructure itself a target?
So essentially, it's about targeting data and access to systems. So cyber attacks, such as ransomware attacks, where data is encrypted and a ransom is demanded. Distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks that overwhelm systems. Business, email compromise scams, BEC scams, and phishing attacks designed to steal credentials. All of these are aimed at infiltrating digital infrastructure to steal valuable data, disrupt operations, and extort payments. And the range of targets is constantly expanding beyond traditional computer networks to include things like Internet of Things devices, contactless payment systems, and even exploiting vulnerabilities in emerging virtual environments like the metaverse, you know? So the digital landscape itself has become like this primary battleground.
Yeah, it really highlights that ongoing arms race between criminals and law enforcement in the digital space.
Yeah, it's a constant cat and mouse game.
Right, exactly.
It really is.
So let's move on to the third major shift the report identifies, and that is how AI and other new technologies are accelerating serious and organized crime.
Yeah.
This feels like it could have some really profound implications.
It does, and the report kind of frames this acceleration in two key ways.
Okay.
So first, as a catalyst for entirely new forms of criminal activity. And second, as a powerful driver for, like, significantly increased criminal efficiency across existing operations. And, you know, the potential impact on the scale and sophistication of crime is considerable.
Yeah, let's start with AI as a catalyst for crime.
Okay.
So how is it opening up entirely new criminal avenues?
So as AI-driven systems, particularly large language models, LLMs, and generative AI, Gen AI, become more sophisticated and readily accessible. They are dramatically lowering the barriers to entry for a wide range of digital crimes. So now individuals with even relatively limited technical skills can leverage these powerful tools. So for example, Gen AI can be used to craft highly convincing and multilingual messages for sophisticated phishing scams. Target potential victims with unprecedented precision based on vast amounts of data. Generate sophisticated malware with minimal coding knowledge. And, most disturbingly, even produce child sexual abuse material.
And that last point is particularly chilling. It underscores the potential for truly novel and harmful forms of crime.
Absolutely.
So it's essentially democratizing digital crime in a very dangerous way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, what about AI as a driver for criminal efficiency? How is it making existing crimes faster, cheaper, or more effective?
So AI's automation capabilities are really poised to transform many aspects of criminal operations. Mm-hmm. So think about automating phishing campaigns to reach exponentially more victims with personalized messages, right, executing large-scale cyber attacks with greater speed, precision, and coordination, mm-hmm, and even enhancing social engineering tactics to be far more persuasive.
Right.
Right. So by automating tasks and analyzing vast data sets, criminals can achieve a much greater impact with fewer resources, significantly expanding their global reach.
Right.
The report also raises the concerning possibility of fully autonomous AI, potentially leading to entirely AI-controlled criminal networks operating independently.
Right. That idea of autonomous criminal AI sounds like something out of a dystopian science fiction scenario.
It does, but it's a possibility that we need to seriously consider.
Yeah, and the report also touches on this tactic of store now, decrypt later. Mm-hmm. Can you explain the significance of that in this context of, advancing technology?
Yeah, so this represents a long-term strategic approach where criminal networks, sometimes potentially acting on behalf of hybrid threat actors, are collecting and storing massive amounts of encrypted data.
Okay.
Right? So the underlying strategy is that as decryption technology advances, particularly with the future potential of quantum computing, they will eventually be able to unlock this vast trove of currently inaccessible information.
Right.
So this poses a significant long-term threat to sensitive data held by governments, businesses, and individuals,
Yeah.
It's a waiting game.
Right.
Banking on future technological breakthroughs.
So they're essentially future-proofing their data theft.
Exactly.
Anticipating advancements in decryption technology. And it highlights the need for us to be proactively thinking about future security measures.
Absolutely. And the report strongly emphasizes the critical need for collaboration to effectively counter these AI-enabled criminal activities.
Yeah.
So policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and the technology sector must work in close collaboration to develop robust legal frameworks, effective detection tools, and consistent regulations to address these rapidly evolving threats.
Right.
The speed of technological innovation demands a proactive and unified approach.
Okay, so the EU-SOCTA report also kind of delves into some of the key tactics employed by serious and organized crime, and importantly, how these tactics are being amplified and adapted in this changing landscape we've been discussing. So let's touch on a few of those key tactics.
Okay.
What's particularly insightful is how these tactics often act as cross-cutting enablers across various crime areas.
Yeah.
So criminal finances and money laundering, for instance, are becoming increasingly sophisticated with a move towards parallel financial systems facilitated by digital platforms and cryptocurrencies.
Right. And the recent takedown of ChipMixer, which was this cryptocurrency mixing service, allegedly responsible for laundering billions of euros in crypto assets linked to dark web marketplaces and ransomware attacks.
Yeah.
Really underscores the sheer scale of this digital money laundering that's happening.
That's an astonishing amount of illicit funds being moved.
It is.
Through these digital channels.
Yeah.
And the report also highlights the continued and widespread criminal exploitation of, seemingly legitimate legal business structures.
Right. This remains a highly effective tactic across virtually all crime areas.
Right.
So legal businesses are strategically misused to facilitate and conceal criminal activities, as well as to launder the substantial profits generated.
Right.
This blurring of the lines between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise makes detection and prosecution significantly more challenging.
Exactly. And corruption, as we discussed earlier, is like a destabilizing factor. Is also becoming more deeply entrenched and adapting to the opportunities presented by the digital age.
Exactly. So we're seeing corruption increasingly facilitated online with the targeting of individuals holding critical digital access.
Right.
The use of digital platforms for recruiting corrupt officials and the expanding role of these intermediary corruption brokers operating within the crime as a service ecosystem.
Right. It's a systemic issue that underpins, a significant portion of organized criminal activity. And sadly, violence continues to be a core tactic for these criminal organizations.
It does, and alarmingly, it's intensifying in certain areas,
right,
with instances of violence even spilling into public spaces. So the report highlights the concerning rise of violence as a service, where professional criminal actors operate across borders, and this disturbing trend of online recruitment of individuals.
Including young people.
Right.
To carry out violent acts.
Right, and we've seen tragic examples of this, right? Like the CVLT online child exploitation ring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where violence was a component.
Where it was a key component.
Yeah, and this whole deliberate exploitation of young perpetrators is a particularly disturbing trend.
It's a calculated tactic employed by criminal networks to evade detection, because these younger recruits often have limited knowledge of the broader organization and may face less severe legal consequences.
Right, exactly.
Like, their recruitment methods are also evolving using tailored language and online channels that resonate with youth culture.
Right.
So it's a really troubling development.
Yeah. Okay, so let's briefly now turn our attention to how this evolving DNA is impacting specific crime areas that the EU-SOCTA report highlights. Cyber attacks are clearly a major and growing concern.
Absolutely. We're observing a significant increase in both the frequency and sophistication of cyber attacks.
Largely fueled by the expanding crime-as-a-service market. KNS, where even those with limited technical skills can procure attack tools and services. The motivations behind these attacks are also increasingly complex, with some showing potential alignment with state-level interests. Data has become a central commodity, and tactics like exploiting software vulnerabilities and targeting supply chains are becoming more prevalent. Ransomware attacks, such as the notorious Lockbit example, remain a significant and costly threat. And as we've discussed, the integration of AI is poised to drive even more sophisticated and difficult to detect attacks, including the use of deepfakes and voice alteration.
And it seems like online fraud schemes are proliferating at an alarming rate as well.
They are. They're expanding rapidly and generating enormous profits for criminal organizations. The narratives used in these scams are becoming increasingly realistic and personalized, thanks in part to AI-generated content.
Cryptocurrency is also playing a growing role in facilitating these frauds. Investment scams, such as the large-scale Juicy Fields Ponzi scheme and business email compromise attacks, are particularly widespread. And AI is lowering the technical barrier for even novice criminals to launch these kinds of operations. Even romance fraud is expected to become significantly more convincing with the use of AI-enhanced realism.
And the horrific issue of, online child sexual exploitation continues to transform.
Tragically, it's being significantly nurtured by the ever-expanding online victim pool and accelerated by advancements in AI, which is making the production of synthetic child sexual abuse material easier and more prevalent.
We saw this in that disturbing case of the Danish national distributing AI-generated content for subscription.
Exactly, and the frequency and severity of these offenses are increasing. And offenders are becoming increasingly tech-savvy in their use of encrypted communication.
And other countermeasures to evade detection.
And migrant smuggling remains a persistent and complex challenge for the EU.
It's a large-scale criminal enterprise that is constantly adapting its routes and methods.
And we saw this, so tragically illustrated by this situation on the Russia-Belarus border.
Absolutely. Where the instrumentalization of migrant flows by hybrid threat actors is a deeply concerning trend, and online platforms are playing an increasingly crucial role in facilitating these operations, despite the devastating human cost involved.
And we saw how routes shifted, for example. Individuals seeking entry through different member states, often paying, significant sums.
Huge sums of money.
In the range of 3,000 to 5,000 euros per person in some instances.
It's a lucrative business.
And the trade in illicit drugs continues to be a highly dynamic and globally significant criminal market.
It's a dynamic global business generating massive profits. And having like a profound destabilizing impact on societies.
Right.
We're seeing a constant diversification of trafficking routes.
Right.
The increased use of seemingly legitimate legal businesses as fronts for drug operations.
Yeah.
And the growing exploitation of online tools for communication and distribution.
Right.
New production methods, particularly for synthetic drugs, where the EU is unfortunately becoming a global production center, including novel psychoactive substances, NPS, and highly potent synthetic opioids like nitazines.
Right.
You know, as tragically evidenced by recent discoveries of clandestine labs like the one in Poland, are also changing the landscape.
Right.
Even the heroin market is facing shifts due to the Taliban's ban on poppy cultivation in Afghanistan.
Right.
So it's a constantly evolving landscape.
Right, exactly. And the trade in illegal firearms and explosives presents a critical threat to security.
It does. It's a critical threat because it directly enables violence across a range of other criminal activities. Geopolitical factors, such as the war in Ukraine, are influencing the availability and flow of weapons.
Right.
And technological advancements like online sales and even 3D printing are making firearms more accessible. You know, the example of fully assembled firearms being sold online to contract killers really highlights the dangerous convergence of technology and traditional violent crime.
Yeah.
We're also seeing issues with counterfeit weapons and the misuse of heavy pyrotechnics.
Right. And environmental crime, while sometimes overlooked, poses significant threats as well.
It poses a serious and growing threat to both the environment and legitimate economies. We're seeing an intensification of illegal waste trafficking, which has significant environmental and health consequences. And while the overall market for wildlife crime remains relatively stable, the trade is increasingly shifting online, making it harder to track and combat.
Right. So even more traditional forms of organized property crime
are being impacted by these wider trends.
So while perhaps appearing relatively stable, digitalization is influencing the methods used in organized property crime.
Right, like in car theft, for example.
Exactly, like in car theft, where digital vulnerabilities are increasingly exploited.
Yeah.
We're also seeing a rise in the theft of digital assets.
Right.
And the online selling of stolen goods. Intellectual property crime, including digital piracy and the counterfeiting of physical products, sometimes even using social media influencers to market illicit pharmaceuticals, remains a significant issue. As does pharmaceutical crime, food fraud, and currency counterfeiting.
Right, as illustrated by that recent discovery of the sophisticated euro banknote printing operation in Italy.
Exactly. So even these seemingly traditional crimes are being impacted by the digital revolution.
Right. And finally, fraud schemes targeting the financial interests of the EU and its member states represent a persistent drain on public resources. They do. And these schemes include things like subsidy fraud, customs import fraud, large-scale VAT fraud.
Yeah, and we're talking about some networks involving hundreds of millions of euros, right? Like that 297 million euro case mentioned in the report.
Exactly.
Right. And then also excise fraud are continually adapting their methods, increasingly exploiting online platforms and emerging technologies like cryptocurrencies for activities like sanctions evasion.
Exactly. So the methods are evolving, but the goal remains the same, to defraud the EU and its member states.
Right. So it truly paints a picture of this globally interconnected criminal landscape, and the report underscores the EU's central position within this as a source, a transit point, and a destination for a wide range of illicit activities. And, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine has introduced a concerning new dimension.
It has.
With the proliferation of weapons and the potential for criminal exploitation of post-conflict recovery funds.
Absolutely. I mean, the interconnectedness of these criminal networks across borders is a defining characteristic.